All right, so we're going to start talking about data visualization using JavaScript. And when we do data visualization, we're pretty much always going to be using these big code libraries because there's just a lot of really complex functionality that we need for data visualization, and we are almost never going to write all of that from scratch. So we're going to use a library. There's quite a few of these. Google Charts is one. We're going to use one called Plotly. And we're going to use Plotly because it functions in a way that is pretty consistent with how others function. There's a lot of idiosyncrasy in these libraries, but I think that learning Plotly will help you learn other libraries better. And I think that the way that it encourages you to think about data visualization is also good to help you just understand data visualization itself as a topic better. So we're going to be using Plotly. Specifically, we're going to be using the JavaScript version of Plotly. So if you just Google Plotly, there are many different versions, right? There's one written in Python. There's one if you're doing R, and we're going to be using the JavaScript version of Plotly. And in this video, I'm just going to go over the very basics of using Plotly. So here's my HTML file, and the only thing that is different than what we've been doing before is we're going to go ahead and include a link to the Plotly JavaScript file, and then we're going to link to our file. And I also have jQuery here because in later lessons we're going to do button clicks and things, and we'll keep using jQuery for that. So I include my Plotly file, I include my JavaScript file, and then typically the way these libraries work is I include on the HTML page a blank element with an ID, and that's where the chart will be inserted. Okay, so I have here a div with ID target. So let's take a look at our JavaScript. And I'm going to do all of this inside my jQuery document.ready function. This just runs when the page loads. This doesn't have to be here. This is just how I'm going to do it. So when we are making plots with Plotly, making charts with Plotly, we're going to think about putting together a bunch of options, and then at the very end of our script, we're going to pass those options to this plotly.newPlot function, okay? And this is the function that actually draws the chart on the page. And what I'm going to give it, okay, this function takes several parameters. It takes the ID of the element where the chart is going to be inserted. It takes a data object, which we'll talk about in a second. It takes a layout object and a configuration object. So basically, your thought process is I'm going to build this data object, this layout object, and this configuration object, and then I'm going to pass it all to this function. So let's go up and let's talk about what these look like. So here's my data variable. And again, here I pass it this data variable. And in Plotly, this data variable is an array of things that we're going to call traces. And a trace is a series of data that will be visualized. Okay. So if we think about a basic bar plot, okay, this would be one series of things that we are going to visualize. And if we're looking at the documentation in Plotly, you can see that here is my array. Okay, so again, arrays in JavaScript are square brackets. And here's my trace object. Okay, and objects use curly braces. And let's look at it here. So what I'm doing here is, here's my array, and this array contains trace 1. Trace 1 is here, and trace 1 is an object, okay? And objects have properties that are named, and then we do a colon, and then this property X can be anything. It can be a string, it can be a number, here it's an array. This is why objects are really useful, and it's good to get used to passing options and more complex data using objects. So this is why I like Plotly. So let's talk about this trace. So this is a variable called trace1. I could give it a different name, and it's an object. And the first property of my object is named x, and x is an array with 3 numbers. Y is the next property. Y is an array with 3 numbers. And then I tell it what type of trace this is, or what type of chart, or what kind of marks I'm going to be putting on my XY grid. And I say that this is a scatter, okay? And in Plotly, if you want to get used to using the documentation, I can look up the documentation for scatter plots, okay? And I can see what the traces on my scatter plot look like. Okay, so they take an X that's numerical array, a Y that's a numerical array. They can have a mode or not, and then I tell it type is scatter, and I can see here the differences. So here I've given it X, Y, type is scatter, and then I've made my data variable, and my data variable is just trace1. Okay, so if I wanted to add another trace, I could, and we'll do that in a second. Let's go ahead and look at what this is going to create. Okay, so here's my plot, and I have x is 1, y is 90. Okay, so these are paired. X is 1, y is 90, x is 6, y is 40, x is 20, y is 60. And looking at my documentation, I can see, okay, well, maybe I want lines here. So maybe I'll change this mode to lines and markers. And that's going to be part of this trace. So I can say mode is lines and markers. And just remember that I need commas after all of these except for the last one. Okay, so now if I refresh, well, I still have lines and markers. Let's make it just markers. So now if I refresh, I'm just going to have my points instead of my lines. So those are my traces, and my traces make up my data array. So if we add another trace, and let's say there's another series of points that I want to create, and I'm just going to make up some numbers here. And let's keep this one as markers as well. And now when I say variable data, instead of this array, an array again is a list, instead of just having trace1 there, let's also have trace2 there. And now when I refresh, here's trace2 in orange. Okay, so that's how my data variable works. Okay, here's my layout variable. And again, we pass the ID, we pass data, layout, and configuration. So layout is, again, an object, and this just has a bunch of options for the layout or the appearance of the chart. So I've given it a title. Show legend is a Boolean. If I set show legend to true and we refresh, I now have labels for trace 0 and trace 1. And I've included here a link. So if you want to look at all of the layout options, there are many, many layout options. We can get into that. Configuration options are just some other options that are kind of general to the chart itself. So a nice thing about Plotly is that it is responsive. This chart scales to whatever size I have it in. Many charting libraries, graphing libraries are not responsive, but Plotly is, which is very nice. And another thing to know here about the configuration object is that Plotly comes with a bunch of stuff that you can do. So like I can do this and zoom in. A lot of times we don't want to do that. So there is an option that can go in configurations called static plot. And if we set that to true, then we just get something that's like an image. And a lot of times that's much nicer for us. So again, once I've set up my configuration option, I just call plotly.newPlot. I tell it the ID where we're going. I give it my data array, my layout object, and my configuration object. And this is my pattern, no matter what kind of chart I'm making. So set up my traces, create my data array, create my layout object, my configuration object, pass them in.